All right then, good evening everyone, or good afternoon or good morning, depending on where in the world you are. So welcome to the latest installment in the KangaTech webinars. Tonight we're very lucky to be joined by James Moore, who will be delivering an extensive webinar that you've all signed up for. We've also got James Evans, who's our Customer Success Manager based in the UK, and we've got RJ Archer, Business Development Manager in the US, and myself, Chris Hill, based in the UK. So you've not all signed up to listen to us speak. So pretty quickly, we're going to start running through James's presentation. Now, just a note on that, to align with schedules and time zones, we've actually got a pre-record of the presentation. James is present on the call, but is an extremely busy man, so has had to jump off and take a call at the minute. So we are going to field some Q&A at the end. So if you've got any questions, then please type them out in the thread. And we will try and get through those, or as many of those as we can, towards the end. So yeah, it's pretty much time to get on to the presentation, and we will be sharing a copy of it after the presentation, probably in the coming days. So hope you all enjoy this, take loads of value out of it, and we're going to roll with the presentation. Once again, thanks for joining us.
Okay, guys. Thank you very much for giving up your evening and for coming on this webinar that we've decided to do in conjunction with KangaTech and the Health Development and Performance Network. So we're going to talk about problem solving in elite athlete management with really a large focus around problem solving from a strength diagnostics perspective, albeit we're not going to cover off every aspect of strength diagnostics because just realistically we don't have time. But I'll come back to why we're sort of looking at this and where we're sort of go. So just for those of you who don't really know me from that well, just my background. And while I'm going through my background, if you haven't done it already, if you can jump on the chat and just say what your name is, what your discipline is, physio, physical therapist, S&C coach, personal trainer, whatever that background may well be, and where you currently work as a private practice, elite sport, which team do you work for, anything like that, because it'll just help when we get to the Q&A a bit later on, just frame some of the questions that may come in and share some of the information as we go. All right. So, yeah, my background. So just really quickly, so I trained at King's. I graduated, God, now it will be not far off 27 years or there or thereabouts. So 1996, I graduated. I did a 4-year degree rather than a 3, because that's what you could do then, that long ago. And then I went to University of Queensland and I did my master's in manual therapy, but I really specialized in altered nociceptive processing, so ergo pain science more than anything else, and neurophysiology. I realized that I was pretty good at that stuff and liked it, but really didn't understand biomechanics. So I went up to Strathclyde in Glasgow and did another master's in what was effectively applied biomechanics, but really it was almost a pure engineering master's, and then you got to apply it. And then to complete my academia, I was enrolled in a PhD. It's now on hold with La Trobe and UCL. I'm just too busy with other stuff, so I may get back to that at some point in time, but much more my passion around hips and muscle injuries, which we'll see throughout this presentation. In conjunction with that, trained as an S&C coach over 20 years ago now, and then also trained as an exercise physiologist in another life when I worked in America for a few years. From a clinical point of view, worked track and field with UK Athletics for 9 years, so 2 Olympic cycles. Wimbledon clinics, we had a specialist sort of set up there where I worked with a sports doctor and a radiologist. And then I worked within track and field through Beijing and London Olympic Games with some of our best athletes, which we'll touch upon today as we go through. At the same time, I was really lucky. I ended up falling in and working with England Rugby with someone like the legend that is Phil Pask through into the World Cup in 2011, which is rather apt as we go into the World Cup quarterfinals tomorrow. And then after all of that, I kind of sort of fell into a role within Saracens and headed their medical team for just over a year, but was pretty burnt out, needed a break, and so took a short break from that for a period of time, but basically annoyed Mrs. Moore, who then said, look, you need to go back to work and stop being a pain in my derriere. And I, again, very fortuitously fell into a role with Team GB where I headed up the intensive rehab unit. So a lot of this diagnostic process comes and stems from that time within track and field into rugby, where I developed some systems with Dan Lewington, who's now obviously of the LTA head of performance there and now up at Man City or the City Group Football. And then we kind of specialized in our problem-solving systems approach through the Rio Olympics and into Tokyo. And for Rio, I was a deputy chef de mission. So I headed up all of performance, science and medicine across all 28 sports going in, set the strategy for Tokyo, but again, needed a bit of a career break. So chilled out and ran the clinic in London, which is, or was called the Centre for Health and Human Performance, now known as Marylebone Health. I need to change that logo. And then the education company with Health Development Performance Network. At the same time, again, because of my passion with hips, had an affiliation, or well, headed up Andy Murray's team from a science and medicine point of view for the next 4 years, really, up until the beginning of this year, to try and get him back playing at the highest level, of which I would argue we were pretty successful at doing that, as he got into the top 40 and nearly top 32 sort of rankings. And then now I act as a consultant and work for the Brooklyn Nets basketball team within the NBA. So reasons for doing this, and I'll come back to it in a little while, but the things we're going to cover off. So we're going to look at a little bit around critical thinking within problem solving and some case studies. I'm not going to spend too long on it. It's just more one slide, and then some other slides just to really get you to problem solve a little bit more. Bit background to how did we get here in terms of our problem solving approach. And it's not saying that our problem solving approach is the best approach, it's just saying this is what we use. And hopefully that can stimulate some of you guys to think about things maybe in a similar ilk, or maybe challenge the way you think about some of your stuff and come up with some other strategies that you can use. Like, what are we aiming for when we're problem solving and we're doing some diagnostics, away from the traditional clinical medical diagnostic sort of tree and pathway? So are we looking at aiming for resolving a pathology or an injury? Are we restoring function or particular movement or sequence of movements? Or are we aiming for optimal performance? Now, I'd argue within all spectrums of sport, you're obviously looking at all of that in terms of the process, but it will ebb and flow where you go within that process as you go through it. We need to understand the testing protocols and how do we do that in line with sports. I'm going to do that in particular with a running example, and that's going to be more of our aspect around function and movement. And we're going to look at how do we evaluate vertical force in that sort of profile. Then we're going to look at more of a hip testing profile with a particular sort of aspect around hamstring injuries and what testing protocols and options we might do. And then we're going to look at performance rehabilitating testing sort of process, and what does that continuum look like? And how can you go away from one-off testing to look at more continuous markers within your testing process? And we'll conclude all of that back with the case study in which we started with right at the beginning. Okay. So look, a lot of this started with this guy down here on his haunches / on his knees, Dr. Raphael Brandon, who was our head of S&C within UK Athletics. He was then head of strength and conditioning and head of performance solutions for the English Institute of Sport before he went to be head of R&D at the ECB, so England Cricket, and then now does a lot more consultancy. And we work on a project with Breakaway Science, which is an LA-based company that we utilize some of their diagnostic and innovation sort of work to analyze Andy Murray and how does he move, so that we could get him to move at the right level to play tennis at the highest level. But we started playing around with handheld dynamometry back in, this would have been 2008, 2009, and looking at some testing protocols. And you can see here, Raf, we've got a 100-meter sprinter who went to Beijing, doing a non-weight bearing abduction, but in a weight bearing manner. So unlike the supine or sideline you might see in the literature, we've done it with a fixed pattern here, and we're looking at the abduction on the open chain sort of limb. And again, our argument here, which will be different than what's out there in the research, was, well, we need to look at the energy transfer from the weight bearing limb to the non-weight bearing limb through the whole system. And I'll explain what I mean by some of that in a little while, as opposed to just trying to maybe isolate a movement pathway, or what I would define as a force vector, which again, I'll elaborate. Now that's good, but there's some margin of error. And like, we went on from this within the Olympic world with a guy called Fiam McPartlin, who's now over at Red Bull in Santa Monica in LA. And, you know, you can get your confidence interval down really well with this sort of device, where Fiam was down at around about 2% in terms of that confidence interval. So you can be accurate, but where it kind of evolved was the basis behind this talk and how we've kind of evolved with KangaTech. And so KangaTech is a great device, which is this fixed dynamometer with multiple sort of levels and attachments and different sort of functions. And you can do at least 35 different dynamometry sort of measures on a fixed isometric platform, really quickly and easily. And so we utilize that well. And so it's then just trying to bring this into your practice. But it doesn't just look at the utilization. They've got great software that they can use. And this is, you know, an unashamable plug in terms of KangaTech, because we found it's just streamlined so much of our work. But not only can you test, but you can set parameters for retraining. And then the athlete or the individual in private practice can come in and start their own session and start to retrain particular pathways. And what KangaTech have is they have like some great pathways, whether it be a football risk management pathway, or here you've got a 3D hip profile, which takes about 14 minutes to run through 6 different tests in terms of the pathway. Now we're going to look at that, and they've gone adduction to abduction to flexion to extension to external rotation. And our pathway would be slightly different. And that doesn't mean we disagree with KangaTech. It just means we're looking at maybe something slightly different than that question is looking at there. And that's where the problem-solving approach really comes in, and how you can take different tools, whether that's handheld dynamometry, whether it's Kanga, whether it's some kind of force plate assessment, and you can utilize that within your assessment process and integrate that with other things as well. So Kanga's sort of process is, how do they reduce risk? How can they increase readiness? And how can they restore somebody or return somebody back to athletic play and performance? Now, the other thing that sort of sparked this talk really was over pandemic, I did a couple of webinars, and I just got inundated with it, and it wasn't really meant to be that way. So I did one for informed performance, mainly around hamstring injuries, and then one for Sportsmith around rehabilitating hip and groin injuries. And like, they're great and it's good to do, but I just totally was unprepared for the number of questions and the intrigue and the interest just really in the different ways in which we were looking at some of these protocols and processes that we developed within that world. And I'm not saying again that our systems were right, they're just maybe a bit different, but I think it ultimately comes down to the question you're asking. And if you get the question right and you understand the question you're asking, the test kind of presents itself. And that's the beauty of things like Kanga, is that you can manipulate the tests for what you want. And certainly there are testing protocols that they have in the system that they do. And then we've adapted some of their testing protocols for what we want as well into that process. Okay, so that gives us a little bit of a background. So I want to just move into critical thinking and just challenge the way maybe we think conventionally at present and where we're going with some of this kind of work. Doesn't look like the mouse is working, so I'm going to crack on. So if we're going into critical thinking, the premise here, whenever we're looking at some of this data, and there's lots of data out there in the research, and again, we don't have time to go through all of the research, where people will talk in terms of, right, well, this test does this, and this exercise will influence this muscle in this way. And so look, there's validity and reliability in a lot of that, but again, it may be valid, it may be reliable, but the question is it accurate? So the premise here is, can I prove myself wrong? So no matter what I think I know or I believe to be true, if I can prove myself wrong in that belief or that knowledge basis, then maybe there's another answer. If I can't prove myself wrong, then okay, it may be a flawed reasoning process, but at the moment, I've got no reason to believe that that is not correct. All right, there may well be another rationale that comes up. And so sometimes we don't know what we don't know. And again, I go back to, if you look at hips 20, 25 years ago, everybody had early onset arthritis. Now we know it's a labral tear. Now everybody's got a labral tear, right? And that hasn't changed overnight. That's been like that for 50, probably 70, probably hundreds of years, right? In terms of labral pathology that caused hip problems, we just didn't understand it, right? And now once we understand it, we then see it over and over and over again. So it is based around the body of evidence. So within a reasoning process, you've got a body of evidence that leads to reasoning and logical thinking that leads to conclusion. So we follow the evidence, let the data guide you. Now, then you can sometimes get rationalization where you've got a desired conclusion. And then you're motivated to find something that tells you X, Y, Z. So I'm rehabbing somebody back from an injury. I want to prove that it's strong enough and therefore I'm ready to go back to sprinting. Well, okay, it might be strong enough, but therefore does it go back to sprinting is not necessarily a direct correlation, all right? Because the stronger you are, the faster you run, the greater the increased risk you have potentially of where we're going. So again, it's then coming back to us, and we're seeing more and more evidence that just gets published, and we'll challenge some of the evidence that's published at the moment, and it's just really low quality in terms of what we're looking at. And so you've just got to be careful in terms of how you interpret it, and that's hopefully what I'm going to do a little bit more today. All right, so I want you all guys to all watch this video. It should start here. And I just want you to watch how both people move, right? And I just want you to see what you pick up, what's different between the guy on the left versus the guy on the right. And those of you who know me may have seen this before, but certainly it's interesting for those who haven't, all right? So it's 250 frames a second. It's two elite level 200-meter runners. They're both capable of running 20 point mid, 20 point low. In terms of, and I just want you to look at how they move. While you're looking at it, I want you to put down, who do you think is faster? Go on the left. So I just want fast left, fast L, fast R for right. Okay. And then once you've done that and you think who's faster, then I want you to say who has more injuries, the guy on the right or the guy on the left. Okay. I'll just give you another minute. So injury or ILIR, doesn't matter. Just get a rough sort of snapshot of your thinking. And even if you don't put it in the chat, I just want you to commit. Who's faster, guy on the left, guy on the right? Who has more injuries, guy on the left, guy on the right? All right? That's just a way of just starting to look at your beliefs and your systems as to where we go, okay? Which is an indication in itself, right? Go a few more seconds. Right. So look, they both move differently. The guy on the left is what we'd call a traditionally pretty sprinter. The guy on the right doesn't look aesthetically very nice. Now, the guy on the left is one that the coaches love. Interestingly, he was the faster guy, but he's also the one that had more injuries. Well, he was faster at the time, let's put it like that. And I won't go into why he had more injuries, but in essence, he's a sagittal plane mover. He's resisting and constraining rotation in order to move in a straight line, which has huge amounts of value from a biomechanics point of view in terms of getting from A to B in sprint mechanics. However, if you're constraining rotation to move in a straight line, and then you're losing sagittal plane control, which he is doing at multiple levels, ankle, foot, lumbar, spine, thoracic, then that is really inefficient. All right. And you'll understand why when we get into the biomechanics section a bit later on around force profiling and what we look for. So this is 2005. So by 2007, he'd had multiple injuries. We'd lost him to the sport. I certainly didn't know then what I know now. And I would say, look, we let him down. We failed him. The guy on the right is moving all over the gaff. He's twisting, he's turning, he's fishtailing. The hip is in this abducted, externally rotated, extended position in terms of trying to get there. Now, all of the coaches were like, you know, he doesn't move right. Surely can't we make him move better? And we looked at him, we went, well, maybe we can, but he barely had an injury in 5 years. And he's an Olympic gold medalist from the 2004 4x1 relay squad, and probably the first name on that 4x1 relay squad. And we said, well, maybe he's moving like that for a reason. And if we change it, maybe we increase his profile, maybe he does or doesn't get any better as a sprinter. We just don't know at that moment in time. So we asked, like, how can we sort of break this down and how can we problem solve through this? And so we devised a series of different tests for him, which I'm going to go through in a second. The long and short of it is we worked out that we thought he moved like this for a reason. And that rather than trying to change it, we just worked with it. And we used the phrase of, we got him better at moving badly and more efficient at moving badly, as opposed to make him look nice. And he went on to do really well in 2008, 2009, was probably our number 100-meter sprinter. Then 2009, with a change in coaching philosophy and a new coaching team came in towards the 2012 Olympics. And this is a big, strong Afro-Caribbean male that hasn't been injured in what was probably about 7-8 years at that moment in time. And he ended up with a pretty significant hamstring injury and a pretty significant stress fracture from trying to change the way he moved when he'd already grooved these patterns. So we have certain beliefs, we have certain rhetorics that we think are true and we hold to be true. It's then going back and testing it. So the process, or part of the process we came up with, which again I will elaborate on, and this is Raf, Brandon and I sitting in a bar in London, coming up with a strategy around how do we help these guys back in 2009. And we basically said, and again, this isn't 100% right, but it's a thought process, a system, a philosophy about how we're going to work. How do we look at their force generation and or absorption, right? And some of this will be opinion-based, some of it will be fact-based. So how do we look at their force tests? How do we look at counter movement jumps, etc.? How do we look at their rate of force development? And does that give us a balanced equation versus their elasticity and their tensile strength? So how quickly can they produce energy and how much force can they produce through a bigger range of movement for tensile strength, right? And so we're really looking at stress strain curves. So tensile being strain, force being stress, and then the elasticity is the non-contractile tissue. The rate of force development is the neuromuscular coordination, right? And we're breaking it down like that. And we assumed that actually you would be good at all of them in order to be world-class. And I'll go on in a second to maybe challenge that a little bit. And then we looked at, well, what's their intrinsic capability? So the elasticity and the rate of force development is probably largely intrinsic. What's their technique like? So how well do they execute movement? How are they built? Because that might influence the load and the efficiency of movement. And what's their extrinsic capability? So that tensile and the force generation, so the component. And then if I'm going in a rehab setting, how do I influence? What am I going to influence? The tendon, the fascia, the muscle belly, the empty junction, strength versus cross-section area, recovery versus fatigue, muscle fiber versus conductivity, time, load, and speed. All right, so I want you to take that on a level and then look at these next two, and we'll break it down. So I've deliberately hidden their faces and what's going on so that you, not for any confidentiality reasons, I've got permission to use it, but just so that you just focus on how their legs are moving. So I want you to watch the top girl, watch her run. She's not running top end speed, she's kind of cruising, rhythm-based running. All right. And then the bottom girl, watch her go. She's at the end of like a 200, 300 meter rep. So, you know, swimming in lactate, but still more rhythm-based running than, oh, a little bit jerky. Bandwidth on the computer's not great. There we go. Okay. So that should run back through again in a second, just in terms of what you do. So you can almost hear them running differently. One's caressing the ground, the other one's hitting the ground, right? So again, same question. Who has more injuries? Girl on the left, girl on the right. But injuries left, injuries right. Who runs faster? Fast left, fast right. Girl on the left, girl on the right. Okay. And again, if you've seen this before, you'll understand where we're going. So just to run through it. And again, it's not, don't have to put it, you can put it in the chat if you want and commit, but if not, just mentally commit yourself. So you've got 400-meter runners, both of them. The girl on the left is a world indoor gold medalist in 2007, running 50.05, which is absolutely rapid indoors. World outdoor silver medalist in 2007, running 49.69. Multiple yearly subtalar driven achillodynia, lots of joint related injuries. We'll talk about that in a second. Girl on the right, again, 400-meter runner, so it's a bit staccato. So happens when I'm running two videos at the same time. Try and move that out of the way a little bit more. Yeah, it's not hiding it. That's it. There you go. So 2007. World indoor gold, Commonwealth gold in 2006, Olympic gold, there we go, in 2008, PB of 49.62, so 0.07 of a second faster than the other goal. Multiple yearly subtalar driven achillodynia, okay, in terms of what we're looking for. I'm going to remove this video because it's getting in the way, and I don't want it. There we go. Boom. All right. So let's break that down in terms of our thinking and where we were going a little bit before. So girl on the bottom or girl on the left, bang. So her rate of force development and her force absorption and generation, relatively weak, 59 kilo athlete, could just about squat 80 kilograms for a few reps, not particularly strong. So you're talking, you know, 1.2, 1.3 times body weight in terms of the squat. Rate of force development absolutely through the roof. Her time to depolarization, her neurological twitch response was just off the chart if you measured her on tensormography or anything at all like that. Foot contact time ridiculously fast. I think she was on the ground for 0.18 of a second. And if you think Usain Bolt was on the ground for 0.14 of a second at his best, rapid, quick ground contact time in terms of what's going on, but her tensile capability really poor. So she ran fast because she had high rate of force development and high elasticity, which then gave her very high stiffness and high frequency running, which is what you're seeing. And the high stiffness and high frequency increased the joint overload. So we had back problems, knee problems, ankle problems with her. And when we look at her, intrinsically very good, technique-wise, apart from the subtle foot turnout, very good, but morphology like significant bowing and torsion in her tibias, which is why the feet are turned out, and poor extrinsic capability, right? So really imbalanced on that level. Again, what did we try and influence? And again, this is not a rehab talk, so I'm not really going to touch upon this. This is more of a problem solving. So it again gave us more of a strategy. So we went after tensile range of movement, strength through range, and passive capabilities. We looked at cross-sectional area and we looked at max force production. Okay. Girl on the right, similar, we've gone through all that stuff with her before. Okay. And then again, now we look at her force generation, rate of force development, elasticity, and tensile. She was strong. So she was 69 kilos, so 10 kilos heavier, but could squat 120 all day long and realistically could have gone like 130, 140. So easily been able to squat twice her body weight, I would argue. Rate of force development, very poor. She needs to be on the ground for a long time. Poor quick ground contact time. All right. But had great tensile capability, was able to produce force through a really big range of movement. Her stride length was impressive and her aerobic capability was off the chart. So she had low stiffness, large compliance, large stride length, had an increased risk of tendon injuries. We had bilateral Achilles tendon ruptures. We had a quadricep rupture. She had a high hamstring tendinopathy. There are a few little joint injuries in there, but predominantly tendon-related injuries as a basis. Intrinsically poor, technique-wise, albeit slightly flatter foot, but the stride length was so good, morphology was good, extrinsic capability was good. But you could argue technique depending on how you want to look at it. But certainly her kinematics were good, albeit her technique aesthetically could have some questions depending on which belief system you want to go down in terms of what's happening, but certainly the kinematics were very good. All right. And I'm aware, or it's one of my favorite phrases, that kinematics and technique are not the same thing. And lots of people get confused between technique and kinematics. All right. Cool. So what did we influence with her? Well, tensile range of movement, strength through range, passive capabilities, but we did a lot more reactivity work and a lot more deceleration mechanics as well. So there was some commonality between the two of them, but some stark differences as well. So taking that on board, I want you to have a look at this guy who's #1 sprinter in Denmark. And he came to see us a couple of months ago with some recurrent issues. And we problem solved through that case. So if I get you to watch him here, he's going to come out of the blocks on the side-on view. And I just want you to watch his movement and see what you pick up. What can you see? And again, just make a mental note of what you're seeing here. All right. Cool. Now let that pause and then let's watch him come out of the blocks from behind. Okay. And I know they're quick, but I deliberately won't do that. So I just want you to pick up what you saw, or what you think you saw, and then we're going to come back and look at that in a bit more detail at the end of the presentation. So this is a slide I use in a different talk, but is athleticism and winning inevitable, and what can we influence? And so why is diagnostics or problem solving so important? Well, again, I think comes down to what we can influence. There's an old phrase by Bertrand Russell that if you want to be an Olympic champion, you choose your parents wisely. And certainly there's some evidence behind that. And it is true that we cannot change our genes, but we can certainly have the ability to change how our genes are expressed. And that leads me on to these two quotes. It's not where you start, but it's where you finish that counts, from Zig Ziglar, one of the famous business people in the world and most successful sort of investors. And then Kevin Durant, the hard work beats talent when talent fails to work hard as a component. So if we can get the diagnostics right and we can work over a long period of time to influence things and put the work in, then maybe we can reduce risk and improve performance. We've also got to be aware of different physiological parameters. So if we're dealing with a world-class marathon runner versus a world-class sprinter, those requirements are going to be different. So our strength diagnostics have got to shift. That different people, different builds, different sports need different requirements. But the thing that's interesting here is when you look at that left hand and look at that top right graph, the average couch potato has just as much type 2X muscle fibers as does a world-class sprinter. And the big difference is that they have a lot more slow twitch and a lot less sort of type 2A, so strength endurance style fibers in that instance. Now that's interesting because what I think happens, and we certainly see this when we're rehabilitating some athletes, is that when they're not training at a high enough level, those type 2As get converted to type 2Xs. So they almost become too explosive. And that's what we want in track and field. We want an athlete to train hard all winter, then gradually taper off, get more type 2Xs. When they come out the blocks, they're so explosive, they win the race. But if that's happening with a football rugby player and you're looking at strength criteria, that athlete might tick a box. Their muscle fiber type might have switched. They're almost too explosive. You then go to train them or run them or sprint them, and then they re-injure because they can't absorb, because the type 2As are not as efficient and they fatigue too quickly, and they're almost too explosive for the tissue quality and the stage of tissue healing. And that's something that's really important to bear in mind. So when we go back to challenging our thinking, we're then thinking about, right, well, is this athlete, even though they've met the strength criteria, really ready to do this? And have I built enough training history within that acute to chronic workload ratio within what I want that person to do? All right. So that led us into this kind of philosophy that we had, where we looked at 4 key pillars, where we looked at structure, function, movement, and metabolism. And that became the underpinning of what we did within the Olympic world, within the Olympic rehab unit. We basically said, and it was partly for communication, but it was partly for integration, that in order to have good structure, we've got to be able to clear it medically. So is there a disease process there? Physiotherapy-wise, can you clear the range of movement and do the provocation tests? Have they got an adequate cross-sectional area in the muscle or the tendon health? What's their nutrition like? What's their soft tissue compliance like? And then we move into function, so the ability to produce force, movement, and metabolism. And it's really just looking at how does every discipline integrate with each other down that pillar to then lead to sports performance for the athlete, with the athlete at the heart and on the foundation of where we go. Now, if we're bringing that into immediate components, it's right. Structure is anatomy, pathology, and provocation. So anatomically, where are we at? Pathologically, where are we at? Are we joint compromised? Yes or no? Is there any provocation there? Yes or no? Now, there might be pathology there without provocation, what we call a silent pathology. So the key here is, can we clear the joint? Can we assess the muscle architecture? And is the muscle architecture appropriate for the area? We'll touch on that in a little while. Then we get to function. We're really talking about force and being dynamic. So can the muscle produce the appropriate force in the appropriate range? Can the non-contractile tissue, NCT, transfer that energy appropriately? All right, and we'll talk about that a little bit later on. When we're looking at movement, there are lots of movement systems, and you might use an FMS or something like that. And like, again, these are things that we don't think are particularly useful, or they're very useful within a limited context. So we want to know, are they efficient at different loads? So with different weight on their back, under a different external force, under different speeds, under different ranges of movement. And so how can we assess that? And we built a system where we could assess that previously, and we're not going to go into that today. We can touch on it. We can't go through that. And can they do that through their kinetic chain, so their lower limb versus upper limb, or through their kinetic system, i.e. their whole body? All right, then metabolically, where are they? Both in terms of systemic metabolism and local muscle. And so what timeline do we need for cell and tissue adaptation? Are we getting that within the training phase? Is this cardiovascular system efficient? Is their local muscular system efficient? And so once we've understood that principal system, we then go into sort of how do we perfect movement and analyze movement. So in the first instance, I want to know, have I got single joint efficiency? And we talk about that as being a kinematic pair. So it's the agonist to the antagonist, identifying the movement that we need for that movement, whether it's coronal plane or sagittal plane, and then the appropriate force and speed for that movement. Then can we move on from that into transfer efficiency, low transfer efficiency, where now we're looking at the kinematic chain. So rather than the kinetic chain, the kinematic chain. And we're bringing all those pairs together in sequencing movement. So you might talk about that in terms of motor control or motor patterning, but within that chain, as opposed to the whole system. All right. And so we're then trying to break that movement down in terms of what that person is doing. And then we might move into system efficiency, single joint, load, so multiple joints, and then total body system efficiency. Where now we're looking at the kinematic system and transferring of energy from the head to the toes, from the fingertips to the toes, etc. Okay. And you might break it down. So when I'm analyzing and testing, I might go, well, have I got kinematic pair efficiency around the pathology? First question. If I don't, then maybe there's no point looking at the kinematic chain, or maybe I need to look at the kinematic chain to offload that kinematic pair in that first instance. So again, it comes down to that problem solving and decision-making process that you might go through your critical thinking. So I'm going to give you a quick example, and there's a couple of these dotted around this presentation, quick case studies of where we go. So this was a Premiership rugby player, recurrent left hamstring related issues. And this is when we were beginning our development sort of sequence in terms of what we did. Now, if you look at him, the gold standard there is at 4,000 newtons for mid-thigh pull, then left and right unilateral mid-thigh pulls. And you can see clearly that he's below the gold standard, but the right side is better than the left. Very simple sort of message. But all of it is well below what we would expect for an elite level rugby player at that height and weight. But then you look at his jump capability, so it's counter movement, squat jump, single leg counter movement, and he's pretty much at gold standard, if not above gold standard on everything. So his capability to use his system as opposed to the strength as opposed to the kinematic chain, albeit mid-thigh pull, you could argue is slightly more system, but force versus dynamic movement and maybe a little bit more elasticity within that movement, big difference. So he wasn't strong enough to possibly play, but he was dynamic enough to play. We then looked at his movement assessment at different loads. So we looked at less than body weight and external load, and eccentric stimulus and the plyometric stimulus. And we looked at basically 7 principles of movement, subtly changed now. So we look at push, pull, twist, bend. So push, pull, upper body, twist, bend for spine, squat, which will also be a hinge movement in terms of where we're going, which is really the bend. And then the squat is obviously a bend with a knee bend, a hinge with a knee bend. And then split squat or lunge, which is more of a coronal plane dominant movement, the squat being the sagittal plane, and the single leg squat or step up being more of a rotational dominant or constrained movement, all right, in terms of the movement efficiency. So, and what we see here was really good to an external load on pretty much everything but the single leg squat. And that was on the left-hand side. And so he couldn't tolerate anything above less than body weight on that left-hand side when all the constraints were in essence removed and need to control multiple variables. However, his pull capability was world-class in his upper body. So we argued the reason why he was able to play rugby is because he was dynamic and elastic in his movement, and he basically pulled himself along with his upper body, and his leg strength just wasn't there. And once he was on a single leg, he couldn't control it, and that's why he kept getting recurrent injuries in terms of what he's doing. Quick snapshot, is it 100% right? Maybe, maybe not. But again, we're talking that's probably 10 years ago now that we were doing this in terms of that kind of work, or just under. I think it would have been January 2014, if my memory says. It's March 2014 is the end date there, so not far off. Okay, so now I want to get into meat and potatoes a bit, and I want to look at sports function, and in particular, we want to look at running. So I've set you a little challenge here. There are 8 sports, right? So basketball, tennis, rugby union, rugby league, professional football, AFL, professional cricket, and track and field. And I want you just to put down there, who covers the most distance, and have a stab at which sport covers the most distance, and see if you want to get them in order as well, in terms of how you're looking at that, in terms of the demand, the physiological demand on their body. With tennis, I want you to think about a slam. I want you to think about 5 sets as opposed to you know, a normal 3 sets within an ATP Tour match. So hopefully you've committed some of that there and you're not just waiting for me to give you the answers, because it helps you to commit. And then if you're right, great, tells you you're on the ball. If you're not right, then you've learned something because it's influenced the way you think, right? So basketball, about 4K a game, there or thereabouts. Tennis, about 5K a game in a 5-setter. This is an Australian paper that I got this from, so there may be a bit of bias here because the Aussies tend to like rugby league more than rugby union. I'm sure some people disagree, but there we go. 7K in a rugby union game, 7.2K. That extra 0.2K makes a big difference in rugby league. And then if we're looking at football, you know, classically box-to-box midfielder, 10 to 12K, but obviously in a high press, high running game has been clocked up to 15. And I remember going to FA conferences back in 2005, and we were talking about box-to-box midfielders doing 8K then. So in those almost 20 years, it's almost doubled in terms of distance covered, which tells you the increase in demand on the athlete. We look at Aussie rules here, 13 to 14K a game. We look at cricket in a fast bowler, and now we're looking up to 20K a game within a full 1 day in the field. So 85 overs, you know, 6 balls and over, you know, high level fast bowler that's fit, probably going to bowl 20 overs or thereabouts. So again, you're now talking 120 balls. That's 120 sort of runs in, let alone if they're fielding on the boundary. Again, that increases. Now we look at track and field, and it's going to be about 4K a session. All right. But the interesting thing here is track and field is probably going to be doing, let's say it's a 400-meter runner, they're going to be doing 2K's worth, or at least 1,500 meters worth of high-speed running that's above 7 meters a second. Okay. So disproportionate, 50% of their time is at 7 meters a second. If I took you to high-speed running at 7 meters a second and above, in terms of what would normally be described as sprint distance within some of the GPS within football, you know, that's probably 2, 3, 4, 500 meters max in terms of what they're covering. So, you know, 30% less than the track and field. And realistically, you're talking whatever that is, 1% of their, or 3% of their total distance covered, versus track and field where it's up to maybe 30 to 50% of the total distance covered. So the demand in running varies significantly between sports. So if we look at the biomechanics of running, there are a couple of key questions. How does one go from standing still to maximum forward velocity during sprinting? And this is from Novacek in 98 in one of his seminal papers. And how does the movement strategy change between walking and running? That should say locomotion. All right. And again from Novacek. Now, sprinting is defined at greater than 3.2 to 3.9 meters per second. There's a transition depending on where you are. And you should be moving, into a double float phase where your stance has gone down from 60% down to 36%. You're now up to 7 meters a second in terms of sprint mechanics. And it's the key determinant is vertical ground reaction force that gives you the stride length to get to that 7 meters a second. Your forefoot contact, or your foot contact has changed to more of a forefoot than a heel strike and a hind foot, albeit some people can run at 3.9 meters per second. So it's roughly about 14 kilometers an hour with a heel contact, depending on how fast and how strong they are. Whereas elite level sprinting, as we would define it, this isn't defined in the literature, which is why it's in green, is greater than 7 meters a second, so 24 kilometers an hour. The stance phase is now down at around about 22% from 60 in walking. The stride frequency becomes the key determinant in the swing phase. So the hip now takes over, and you get the synergistic function from hip flexion to extension. That switch that some track coaches will talk about at greater than 9 times body weight intramuscular force. And if we demonstrate that here within Novacek's graph, you can see at the top, that's normal walking at 1.2 meters per second. So 62% is stance, 38% is swing. We then move to running up to 3.2 meters per second. And now we're down to 39% stance phase. We go to sprinting at 3.9 meters per second. We're down to 36. stance phase. We now go to elite sprinting at 9 meters per second. And now we're at 20% stance phase. So only 1/5 of the time is spent on the ground when you're looking at elite. So that just gives you the data there in terms of the exact speed. So an Olympic runner is going to move regularly. Well, they're going to average their 100 meters if they're running sub 10 seconds at 10 meters per second. That's not a one-off 10 meters per second over 10 meters. That's average for the whole time. And what you'll find is someone like Usain, or even some of the girls who are running sub 11 second 100 meters, they're getting up to 11 and a half meters per second as they're going down that track. Okay. So the thresholds of peak force speed may be the best way to assess risk, and understanding that real subtle threshold between what is high speed running on a GPS data, which is normally clocked at about 5.5 meters per second, versus what is sprint distance, which is normally clocked at over 7 meters per second, versus what is max speed, versus what is a percentage of their max speed. If you're going to break it down to 85% as a stimulus and as a buffer or a vaccination towards reducing the risk. So in order to run well, we've got to be able to produce vertical force, and we've got to be able to produce a torque into extension, which gives us a horizontal impulse. Now, lots of people talk about horizontal force, so going from posterior to anterior, moving you forwards. And in biomechanics, that's largely a fallacy. It's a horizontal impulse. The forces are coming from the vertical force with the hip and the arm extension torque. So we've got body weight times gravity, which is 10 newtons, and that gives you your mass. And when we look at the vertical ground reaction force, has got to equal the mass, because under Newton's laws, equal and opposite reaction. We then got an extension torque from the hips and the legs about the center of mass. And then that can also come from the center of mass over the base of support. So some people get back pain because they're almost using their spine as a lever to generate the center of mass over the base of support. And that all results in a horizontal impulse, which is what some people would define as a force there. So if we look at that now and say, well, how do we contribute to that? Well, again, my mouse isn't really working, otherwise I'll try and show you this in a bit more detail. Let's go back one, bang. So if you look at the top graph on the top line, the first dot is really at 3 meters per second. If you go down to the running speed on the bottom, on the horizontal axis in the second, on the bottom graph, and to get from 3 meters to 5 meters a second, it's a 32% increase in stride length, which is directly correlated to vertical ground reaction force. Then to get from 5 meters a second to 7 meters a second, you've got another 17% increase in stride length. So 49% of the ability to get from 3 to 7 meters a second, 49% of that comes from stride length, realistically. And the stride frequency is only accounting for 22% of that increase. Now, once we get above 7 meters a second, the stride length now only goes up by 3%. So nominal change, but now the turnover increases, the frequency increases, and that jumps up by 25%. So 22 and 25 versus 49 and 3. And interestingly, what we end up with is 52 versus whatever that is, 47% in terms of where you're looking at it. And obviously there'll be some point X's in there, which is where you're now getting to that total sort of 100% marker in terms of how you get up to that max speed. All right, and what we then see is the ground contact time reduces and the flight time increases. Now, if we then look at the mapping that Dawn did of what's required, so we look at your calf function at 3.5 meters per second, so 12 kilometers an hour, little bit of quads, hips really doing very little. Up to 18 kilometers an hour, so that 5.2 meters per second, so the classic kind of GPS threshold, again, dominated by your ankle foot complex. Hip, knees kicking in a bit more quad, a bit more hamstring at the knee. Hip, not doing very much, again, still in terms of that. So if you want to get somebody back running, then the key really here is your calf and then your quad complex, which we'll go into. When we get to 24, knees now taking over a bit more, ankle foot still dominating, but knees starting to kick in. Rec fem's kicking in a lot more in that black line in the middle graph. Hamstrings a lot more. Gastroc influence around the knee, quadriceps influence around the knee. Hips starting to work, but not really. And when we get to that 9 meters a second, now the hip takes over and the hamstring at the knee takes over in that biarticular function. So hip and knee being really loaded in terms of what we do. And we can see that nice and clearly here where we get this change in demand. Now, the thing that I find interesting here is when we look at the force length curve on the bottom left versus force velocity curve on the bottom right, we see this change that gastroc soleus complex or triceps surae, in order to run fast, needs more of an isometric contraction that's more velocity based and stiffness based, foot contact time based, than it does longer foot contact time through bigger range of movement, producing lots of force. But to run slowly, gastroc soleus needs to be more higher up the force on the force velocity curve and more in outer range, so more going down that descending limb of the force length curve. All right. So for me, that would then influence, well, what am I doing? If I've got a hamstring injury, how am I training the calves? If I've got a hip injury, how am I training the calves? And what am I doing for the level of running? So do I want to do lots of isometrics? Well, maybe I do, if they've got a history of Achilles injuries, but if they don't, then maybe I want to work them through bigger ranges of movements. When they get back to slow speed running, they're able to do that effectively without overloading other areas. Okay. My apologies, late night last night for work, not for play, unfortunately. So when we put all of that together, sprinting is defined as this 3.2 to 3.9 double float phase, and getting up to 7 meters a second where vertical ground reaction force is king. Key determinant to get there, ankle plantar flexion. So triceps surae's ability to plantar flex up to 7 meters a second. You need the arm drive to get the center of mass forward over the base of support. And then you need that center of mass to be forward leaning, because if the center of mass is forward leaning, you're utilizing gravity. And if gravity is 9.8 meters per second squared, it basically says that in 10 meters, if you're able to use gravity effectively, you will cover off 98 meters. That therefore means that every human being has the capability of moving 100 meters in about 10.2 seconds if you're strong enough to control gravity, which obviously the large majority of us aren't. But what you clearly see here with Hussein is his center of mass is way in front of his base of support, which then gives him more efficiency in terms of the lever arm and the activation. And then finally, we need this quadriceps function to drive the legs forward and give you that vertical force against the calf. So how do we measure calf and what's our strength diagnostics? Well, so one of the things we developed with a guy called Nick Chad, who's now at Chelsea, was at Man City before, and then over in Portugal for a period of time. And then fine-tune that with Theo McPartlin, who I mentioned is over in Santa Monica. We looked at an isometric standing plantar flexion test, and again, gives a huge amount of data. And again, we're going to go to standing versus sitting, and you'll understand why in a minute. We collected 302 data sets across men and women. The lowest was a synchronized swimmer who did pretty much no land training at 1.67 times body weight. And the highest was a rugby sevens player at over 5 times body weight, which is pretty damn strong. We had 30 sets, so 10% of that data pool at greater than 4 times body weight, of which the female rugby players, so it wasn't just male dominant that got over 4 times body weight, were getting over 4 times body weight, which is impressive, right? And that's mainly because we had a concerted effort to train that. And we saw that in rugby, with change of direction, that plantar flexion force and acceleration and deceleration mechanics, that plantar flexion force is really critical in terms of what we're doing. So we looked at the peak plantar flexion. We also then looked at the peak isometric squat, as in the knee extension bias for vertical force test. VFT is vertical force test. And we plot that into a graph like this, where we look at their training age, their discipline, their body weight, the percentages of body weight, so we can equate other things and calculate it, and then look at their single leg plantar flexion force, the max in terms of body weight, single leg squat, relative to body weight, and then what their plantar flexion to squat ratio is like. Because in order to produce that vertical force, as your knee extends and pushes the foot into the ground, the foot's got to plantar flex and push your knee and hip into the air, and therefore your body weight into the air. So you get this equal and opposite force that's been created. So to give you a depiction of that, this is a very famous footballer who had a lot of recurrent sort of ankle injuries. And this is us profiling him at one point, trying to get him back from another different injury, who, again, really good muscle mass, really good hip function, which you'll see in a minute, but just really imbalanced from the ankle foot. And if you look at his right side, which is the problematic side, versus the left, both knee extension and plantar flexion are not strong enough, right? So he's globally weak in that area and could be improved. But the biggest telltale here was the fact that the right quadricep strength was far greater than the plantar flexion. So when you did your quads to plantar flexion ratio, his plantar flexion was at basically 72% of his quads. Was on the left side, it was at basically 90% of his knee extension. So he was getting a much better energy transfer on that left-hand side. And when we looked at his hips, it wasn't really a hip-based issue. So it then starts to drive you that the hips got relative symmetry. Yes, there's a bit of asymmetry between ab and adduction left to right side, but generally it's a pretty good scoring parameter, sorry. And yes, he's globally probably a little bit down in terms of the peak forces we're looking for, but the balance is there. So it then directs us to really go after that calf strength and plantar flexion force. Conversely, this is again a very famous elite female tennis player who again had lots of issues. And you look at her and she's relatively well balanced at 70, at basically 80% and 85% quads to calf ratios in terms of that vertical ground reaction force, which is encouraging. However, what we found with her was that she had significant issues within the hip, particularly the anterior hip, and she'd had multiple hip surgeries. And so that anterior hip just wasn't good enough to stabilize that hip joint anymore and take the pressure off the hip joint. And she just kept upsetting it. And that inner range hip flexion and adduction just not good enough. Now I hear some of you go, okay, well, you've done standing plantar flexion versus knee extension. Well, but what about seated? So there's this paper here that's just come out by Mike Lancaster, Matt Lee, who's over at Northampton Saints, and Laura Tullock, who's at Saracens. All three are really, really good first-class practitioners. However, I have to say the testing data in this is not very inspiring. So you've got 355 great subject group at an average body weight of 105 kilos, and you're looking at an average force output of 1.86 times body weight on a seated calf raise. Well, I'm telling you, on a standing calf raise, you're getting 5 times body weight in rugby sevens players. And some of those guys played, a lot of those guys played 15s at a very high level in terms of the data that we've got. And I'll show you their data in a minute. And we've got seated calf raise much higher than that in other places. So the highest in this rugby group was 2.09 times body weight. So it either tells you that a lot of these professional rugby players are really, really weak, which, you know, you look at rugby players, they're muscle bound, they're big, powerful athletes, they're very resilient. They can't be very resilient if they're weak. Or this area is massively undertrained, which is a conclusion you could draw. Or it tells you that the test just is not testing what you need it to test. All right. And so even though it's validated, even though it's reliable, it's probably not doing what you need it to do. Now, if I was using that test as a benchmark for early stage rehab, or to get a baseline of have I got a relative limb symmetry index or something like that, then it might give me that. But is it really testing strength? No, it's not. It's just testing a force output at a particular joint range, which may or may not be maximum force. And so we've got to be really clear that when we're testing strength, we want to test maximum force to get a true indication of what's going on. So I don't think that this data is great, and you're going to see why in a second. Now, if we compare that to here, KangaTech seated calf raise test, and we might play out what this setup here in terms of this. And again, this is from a colleague of mine that worked within the Belgian football team. But the data on the right-hand side comes from Sportsmith, from some profiles that were done off another Premier League team. And again, we're looking here at seated ankle isometric test, gold standard being twice body weight. Well, the gold standard in football is twice body weight. In rugby, they only just got to twice body weight, and they're at 1.86 times as their average, right? So, okay, they're within the minimum requirements and the gold standard, but you'd also think body weight rugby players, force production, sprinting, change of direction, maybe it needs to be a little bit higher. Their plantar flexion in standing, the ankle isometric in the footballers here, the gold standard is over at 3 Newton kilograms, right? So again, I would argue that's low. Our minimum requirement is 3.5 times body weight, but we're dealing a lot more with Olympic athletes. And so I think it needs to shift a little bit in terms of where you're going. Certainly when I first spoke to Nick Chad and Fionn about this years ago, they were like, you're mad. No one gets over 3.5 times body weight. And I was like, well, I just don't think we train it properly. And then once we started training it with Dan Howes within the England rugby setup and the England 7 setup, that's when we started seeing these force outputs that's 5 times body weight. And not only that, but we started seeing a reduction in injury. So just to put this into context again, this is our data collection when we're doing a full profile, and it's got the KangaTech, the seated ankle, hip and knee, thigh profile, the hip profile, the ratio profile, and then we've got the vertical ground reaction force, and then we've got some rate of force development stuff, some hop tests, some jump test data, and we've got a gold, silver, bronze standards that we've set, and we vary that male, female, etc. Now, this is a female cricketer who is an amateur female cricketer. She's not professional. She likes training. She trains pretty much every day, but she doesn't have the same time and input like a lot of the professional athletes can do. Now, you look at her, she's at 67 kilos body weight, and she's producing 90 kilograms seated plantar flexion force and 101. So she's producing 1.3 times body weight pretty much in terms of that seated calf raise in an untrained female individual. Well, that's got to challenge us when we start to think that 1.86 or 2 times body weight is a good score. I would say it probably isn't. So either we're not training the muscle properly, or the test is not telling us what we really need it to tell us from a force output perspective. We then look, if you look down here, my mouse isn't working, so again, apologies, guys. It's the way I've set these screens up, so my apologies. But if you look down in the middle bit where it says vertical ground reaction force, and you've got the 2 gold items at 3.02 and 3.5 for symmetry index, which is very good. You know, her plantar flexion force is at 2.75 and 2.8 times body weight. So she's just below on the standing that 3 times 3 newtons per kilogram, if we were looking at it from that perspective. So again, she's just off what Premier League footballers would be getting. So again, I think we've got to question, what are we really testing with some of this stuff, and where are we going? And now here's the really big challenge that hopefully will raise your ceiling a little bit in terms of what you look at. Now, this is a completely different test. And this comes from one of my colleagues, a guy called David Sadkin, who's a brilliant S&C coach, and he's a track athletics coach as well. Now, he's doing a talk in a couple of weeks that we're due to set up on acceleration mechanics and things you can learn from coaching versus S&C in order to optimize acceleration. Now, I borrowed this from him, and I make no apologies on that because it's a brilliant bit of work, but he's also going to elaborate on this way better than I can. Now, the guy on your left that you can see is the fastest man ever clocked over 60 meters. And what he did was they measured his power output on a Kaiser. And we can argue about validity of this at this moment in time, but it just maybe stretches your mind a little bit in terms of where we want to go. And he produced 2,700 watts at 110 kilograms of load. Now, when we normalize that power output from a wattage point of view, and we account for the non-contractile tissue and the amplification from the tendon in the power output, when we look at some of the work that I'll show you in a little bit by Reeves, we account that the tendon may account for up to 5 times that force. So the muscular force is about 540 kilograms. The body weight of the individual is 70. That means his plantar flexion force is at 7.71 times body weight. Now, if you go back to some of the architectural data, they'll tell you Soleus is capable of producing up to 8 times body weight, Gastroc up to 3-4 times body weight. Pavel Komi when he measured the force output at the Achilles tendon in sprinting, and he put a transducer onto the Achilles tendon. So very accurate, albeit, N of 1 data. He measured the force output at the Achilles tendon in sprinting at 12.5 times body weight, or 9,000 odd newtons. So somewhere we've got to find this transition between what we're testing, why we're testing it, what's it really telling us, and where the outcome in performance needs to be. So would I use the CT calf raise test on a KangaTech or on the device done by Mike Lancaster there? Yes, I would. But would I say it is an end stage criteria and outcome? Absolutely not. It is beginner-based strength testing in terms of where you're looking to go from a running sprint mechanics point of view and return to sport and performance point of view. This is the data we had from the guys, and you can clearly see here, when we first tested them, they were nowhere near over 3 times body weight. Then basically Housley worked with them for a good 6 months to a year. And you can see that pretty much 23 of the 26 data sets got over 3.5 times body weight. And the others were like 3.4, 3.35, basically below that body weight, which is really close in terms of their max force output and where we want them. A lot of symmetry when you trained it well. What we also saw was that the injury profile in terms of ankle sprains and other things all reduced in terms of that injury profile. Okay. Just conscious of time, so I'm just going to maybe speed up a little bit. As always, I've put too many slides in here, but I'm also trying to give you a lot of information. So if we now move from sport to hip profiling, I want you to watch this girl here and watch her just come out of the blocks. Okay, it's going to happen repeatedly. Just identify that technique, right? Now, this is her injury history: traction apophysitis, partial rupture of rec fem, lumbar spine overload, left hamstring strain, left hip and groin strain, left hamstring strain, right hand side Achilles, left hand side buttock, right hand side buttock, left rec fem strain, right adductor longus strain. All right, so jumping around. Structurally, so what's your structure, function, movement, metabolism? Structurally, she's got a scoliosis. She's got femoral antitorsion. She's got mobile hips with a rotation axis of 115 degrees. She's got tibial varium with a mobile cable foot. So there's a lot going on structurally in terms of what we want to do. All right. So I'm going to come back to that. So, and what did we do and how did we go about sort of trying to sort her out? And we really reduced her risk quite considerably. And then we go into, well, what does this mean from a running point of view? So quick recap in terms of what we looked at earlier with the sprinting defined as over 3.2 to 3.9 meters per second, and that double float is predominantly coming from the ankle foot as the vertical force driver. That's the key function. And so with anybody going back to running, you need that good calf strength. So whether you test that initially on KangaTech and then progress that, again, is a good option to look for. We then look at the arm drive. So we can then look at shoulder capacity, which we can test on the KangaTech, and look at its ability to do that. We can move towards the ability to bring your center of mass forward over your base of support and use gravity to accelerate you, which is then your trunk capacity, which is pretty, again, important. And we can test that through some of the Kanga profiles or through some of your trunk endurance profiling. And then we can look at the knee extension profile. And whether we do that through a vertical force or one of the other things, which I didn't go into earlier on the Kanga profile that we do, is we do that knee stability or stance stability. So we're looking at knee extension capability versus ankle plantar flexion capability to give us that initial first step and stride length that you need for running as a testing database. Now, as you increase that and we start to move up from 7 meters per second to 9, and we're going after that stride frequency that we talked about, now we're really interested in the hip profiling. So, you know, if I was going down early stage rehab with anybody or early stage performance-based decisions, I would look at shoulder function, trunk function, knee and ankle as a starter for 10 as a profiling system. As I go towards top end performance markers, then I'm going much more down a hip profile. So this is where your hamstrings then become what we talk about as a paradoxical knee extensor, which is a mouthful, but really what we're saying is when the foot hits the ground and you're producing hip extension, because your center of mass, your body weight is moving over the top of the foot, you're still actually, the hamstrings are producing a knee extension moment whilst producing that hip extension moment. So it becomes this, you know, unthought of knee extensor as opposed to just a knee flexor, hip extensor, or decelerator of the knee in open chain, as you see in sprinting, which is the next element. So we know that the hamstrings will decelerate the shank in terminal swing phase as a biarticular muscle, and therefore looking at hamstring function in stance phase, so 0, 30 degrees knee flexion, which I'm going to show you in a minute on the KangaTech, versus looking at it in open chain, outer, mid and outer range, so 90-90 versus 90-45, which again we'll show you in a minute. Completely different questions that you're asking from a stance stability force point of view, vertical force point of view versus a swing point of view. We then need to think about adductor magnus. We need to look at that hip extension force in outer range to take the pressure off the hamstring. And then we need to look at the contralateral hip flexion force in outer range. And so then one of the things we look at is that swing phase profile, where we look at left hip extension versus right hip flexion as a torque production to be able to produce that switch that you look for in running. And again, that's something that David covers off quite a lot when his acceleration program that he's going to be teaching. So I'm going to take you back just a little bit. So we understand running. I just want to go back to a bit of biomechanics here and fundamental mechanics around the hip when we're hip profiling. So if we go back to basic mechanics, we know that within mechanics, vertical force is primary as a force vector profile, horizontal force, which is medial to lateral, so left to right, not forward to backwards, so aft to stern in that instance, or anterior to posterior, as we talk about in the physio world, is that horizontal force is secondary, and the tertiary force is rotational. But with a lot of sporting movements, you end up producing a rotational movement and a rotational force. But that is predicated on having enough vertical and horizontal force to do that in the first place. So what we observe in sport as a rotational component is probably the end point from an engineering point of view. And we've got to make the decision between, is this an observable movement and something we're trying to control and utilize the efficiency, or are we looking at the force capability here? And then we look at the movement side of it, where we say primary movement is sagittal. So if you look at nearly any joint and you look at its sagittal range of movement, so let's take the hip, as that's what we're doing, 140 degrees flexion versus 70 degrees extension. You look at the lumbar spine, 60 degrees flexion, 30 degrees extension, 90 degrees, right? Total axis of movement in the sagittal plane versus the hip, 170. You compare that to coronal, let's say the hip, let's say you've got a mobile hip, and you've got 30 degrees abduction to 30 degrees adduction, so 90, you know, it's near enough, just under half of, or just over half of the total range. Same with side flexion in the lumbar spine, right? If you're lucky, 30 degrees each side. So again, 60% of that spinal movement. And then the rotational movement is, again, tertiary. It's because rotation is a coupled movement with coronal. So when we're looking at breaking down mechanics, we need to understand that. So if we're measuring force and we're measuring capability, we need to go back to first principles, which is vertical and sagittal plane. So if we take that and apply that to the hip joint as a ball and socket joint, because it's circumferential, that force is differentiated or dissipated the whole way around the joint. And we look at Newman's work from 2010 from a kinesiology, which is the kind of American terminology for biomechanics. We look at, on the left-hand side, you can clearly see here glute max, glute med, both producing that extension torque in a very similar way to semimembranosus, biceps femoris, adductor magnus. Slightly different vector profile, but they're all producing that extension torque and a slightly different lever arm. We then move to ab and adduction, and glute med, glute min, glute max on the right-hand side all have almost an identical abduction moment arm and direction of force. So the relative force vector is the same. Now, can we bias certain muscles within certain movements that we're looking for? Yes, we can. And so if we test abduction in abduction, we're probably biasing glute med because it's got the most mechanically efficient fibers to operate in that way, and that gets into muscle architecture. But if we're then testing abduction in neutral or in adduction, then we're probably testing a lot more glute max because, again, it's got a longer lever arm, or certainly if we're in hip flexion, it's got a longer lever arm to then produce that. So the point here is that all of these muscles are producing the same movement. So rather than thinking we're being muscle specific, we need to be movement, or I would argue force vector specific in terms of what we're looking for. Now that then goes biomechanically into what we talk about in terms of Codman's paradox, which was originally talked about in 94 and or before that, but published in 94 by Harriman, where we talk in terms of shoulder movement. And Codman's paradox in the shoulder basically states that if I put my arm across my body here and I bring it above my head, so I go into full elevation through flexion, which is sagittal plane and or vertical force, and then I go into adduction, which is now coronal plane and therefore horizontal. What's happened is I've started in internal rotation, but moving sagittal and then coronal, I've ended up in external rotation. So I have not rotated, but by effectively moving through sagittal and coronal plane, vertical and horizontal, I've now controlled the tertiary movement, which is rotation, both in terms of movement and in terms of force. And when we look at that in the hip, what we see here from Newman's vector profile is this hierarchy of hip strength. So we get hip extension as being the dominant, hip flexion, and I'll give you the numbers on this a bit later on, being a little bit less, adduction being stronger than abduction, which is stronger than internal rotation, which is stronger than external rotation. And historically in physio, maybe not so much now, we used to focus a lot on abduction, external rotation. And 10, 20 years ago, certainly something I would have done a lot with my rehab. And what I'm doing is I'm retraining two of the weakest movements in the hip. And then I want to know why the patient isn't getting better. Well, it's probably because I'm under conditioning them in terms of what they need to be able to do. So understanding the mechanics here is important in terms of where you go, and getting that extension back is critical. And why are the adductors more important than the abductors? Well, pretty much, all of your adductors are hip extensors. So when you train extension, adduction is going to increase. And then all of your adductors, apart from Magnus, are hip flexors. So it's also going to increase there. And therefore the adductors then augment the flexion and extension. And we can also look at things like medial hamstrings. So semimembranosus is the strongest hamstring, also has an adduction moment arm. So it's going to increase the adduction force as well as the hip extension force. So training those muscles in that way and stressing them or assessing them that way is critical. So if we go back to that female sprinter now, and this is her hip vector profile done on a KangaTech, and looking at all of our different profiles. And like I said at the beginning, it might be slightly different than what's in the 3D profile that Kanga utilizes, but we're asking a different question on an N of 1, and that's totally fine. You know, you've got a useful tool that can do lots of different things. It's about applying your mindset and your brain towards that tool to get the answers you need to get out of it. And what we clearly see here is an athlete that's had multiple muscle injuries, but we look at the green sections, and her hip extension and outer range hip flexion forces are just off the chart. And even a hamstring force on that right-hand side is off the chart. She's at nearly 470 newtons of hamstring force, which as a female lightweight sprinter is better than most male professional sports people in lots of ways, right? Maybe not the top end, but certainly better than the majority of them out there. And even when we look at her yellow section, at hip extension and hip flexion, she's in the 400 Newton range. And even that hamstring at 0.30 is at 390 Newtons, which is still impressive. So the point here is this girl is trying to run, or she is capable of running 11. At this time, when we did this, she was running 11 flat, 11.1. She hadn't broken 11 seconds. And we were trying to understand, right, well, why is she getting injured? And she's getting injured in lots of areas where she's stronger, not where she's weakest. And so her body's shifting that vector profile. If we're then talking about that kinematic pair or the kinematic chain, it's shifting it to the strongest area rather than the weakest. And what we identified here was that adduction was really down. Now, there's obviously some things there in red that need to be addressed, but in the gray, the adduction is really down. And you can see that within this vector profile that we've got here, which we produce off the back of the data. And one of the big things we did with her was go after her adduction function. And that's through extension, that's through flexion, that's through adduction, but trying to go after that functionality of adduction as a vector. And by doing that, we gave her more support to her hip, her thigh, her pelvis, and allowed her to execute her muscle function much better. And you'll see the result of that in a second. So to help you with this, this is like if you take a screen grab, or this is like how we collect some of our data within what we look for. So whether that's a bilateral abduction versus a unilateral abduction at 30 degrees of abduction, so we're not in neutral anymore. Again, we're trying to optimize that muscle lever arm in terms of what we're looking for, which again, I'll explain in a little bit. And then look at all the different inner versus outer ranges, look at the torques, internal versus external rotation. So it's all there, albeit we don't do internal versus external rotation as much as we do everything else. And then you've got this stance stability ratio, which is the abduction to extension component. We've got the stride length, which is the knee to ankle, and we've got the stride frequency, which is the contralateral hip extension to hip flexion. And you can do the maths on that, and you can come up with your numbers along those lines. And again, it requires a lot to go through all the different kind of numbers, whether it's male, female, tall, short, heavy, light, etc. The long and short of it is just to give you an outcome on this. This is her literally 3 months later into adapting her strength and conditioning program and changing her strength profile by looking at analyzing the data in the right way, in our opinion, and then applying the treatment strategy or the exercise strategy according to where you feel the deficits are and what you feel we need to change and or improve. And even on the still shot, you can look at that first step, and on the left-hand side, your left, she's coming up much higher. She's got good parallel lines, which David will teach you about when he does his course. But she's not able to keep her body weight forward because she doesn't have the leg strength and the trunk strength. You then look to her right, which is 3 months later, and now immediately you've got a much more acute angle, right, in terms of where she is. So that angle is way better in terms of the vector profile to produce that horizontal impulse of the vertical force and the hip extension torque that she's doing. And when I run the video here, you'll then see the stride length and the frequency. So that's the one you've seen already. Just run it through one more time. And then this is her running off the other one. And again, much bigger stride length in terms of where she's gone. Now she's gone on and kicked on. She's moved on. She's learned stuff from what we taught her. She's now working with a different coach overseas. And has got much better running mechanics wise, and now she's running sub 11 seconds, which is great to see from her point of view. Okay, so testing wise, we've touched upon a lot of this. Key thing here for me is just understand your muscle physiology again. So we know that muscles produce optimal force in their mid-range of their resting length, and if you're in outer range, the actin and myosin is too far apart, and you're at a mechanical disadvantage. And if you're in inner range, they're too close together, you're at a physiological disadvantage. Now that can be beneficial to test in those positions depending on the question you're asking. But if the question's around recruitment and efficiency, then that inner range position is useful. And even if it's around possibly deceleration, although the deceleration will also have a component with strength. If it's around strength, then you need to be in mid-range. The one thing to take on board here is when you move to the other force length curve where the passive structures come in, which is the green line there, the passive integrity of the tissue can augment the force in outer range. And so rather than the force dropping off, the force increases. Now, this is the problem of some of the testing protocols that we utilize. So let's say we take this into hip flexion, and hip flexion in inner range, so 90 degrees hip flexion, we're going to look at the stability around the hip joint. At circa 45 to 60 degrees of hip flexion, depending on the height, the weight, the range of movement of the individual, will be roughly mid-range for optimizing hip flexion function. But what happens with the hip flexors is when you get into outer range, because two of your most powerful hip flexors, which are psoas and adductor longus, have a lot of tendon slack, you actually facilitate their force output in outer range because of that tendon slack, and that passive integrity in the green line takes over, and you'll see an increase in force output quite often in very strong, powerful sprinters in that outer range hip flexion force. Now, that's not a bad thing for them, and certainly if I'm looking at kicking sports and running sports, that might be something that I want to look to achieve. And so we get this ascending force vector profile in hip flexion versus this bell-shaped curve that you naturally see from the muscle physiology research that's been done. So if we go back to Newman here and we look at that abduction, again, here's our kind of standards where we'd say, right, extension is gold. Hip flexion is 90% of extension. Hip abduction is 80% of extension, so 20% less. So let's say extension is 50, abduction should be 45, extension should be 40. And the abduction should be 60% of the extension profile. Okay, so now we're looking at around 30 kilograms, which, like, when you start to profile lots of hips, that's not an uncommon ratio that you see: extension at 50, abduction at 30, and that's not bad. And then adduction around 35, 40, depending on what type of sport they're playing. Are they kicking sport? Are they speed sport? And the rotation is the weakest movement, and rotation sometimes down around about 15 kilograms. And that's important from a control point of view. And so definitely do it if you're looking at a control problem. But if we're looking at a strength problem and you're measuring rotation, you're probably a few steps on, and you need to go back and get the strength profile right and then come back to the rotation for the control element. So if I show you this, this is kind of all the different testings that we would do as a quick hip element. So yeah, the volume will come off on that. What we see here is this optimal force is roughly 80 to 120% of their resting length in that kind of mid-range position. All right, so quite often you might start, if you've got Kanga, you don't need to do this next part where you start slightly longer and then you get them to pull into position. If you're doing that on a handheld dynamometry, then you might start slightly longer and get them to pull, because as they pull and they pull hard enough, you might move a little bit, and so you go in a range, or you go back to mid-range from slightly on the descending limb of the force length curve. Whereas if you start that bang on inner range and then they move you, then by the time you've got through the strength component, you're in slight inner range or on the ascending limb, and you're at a physiological disadvantage. Okay, so set the test up according towards what you're trying to test. And so we might need to go, quite often we want to know what's happening through that whole force length curve, so inner range, mid-range, outer range, and get a force length profile within the individual, depending on the question we're asking. So here you can see top left is, just double checking, is bilateral abduction. Bottom left is, so bilateral abduction on short lever, top left, bilateral abduction on long lever. Now you could then do that unilateral, you could do that unilateral in 30 degrees abduction. Then we'll go to like bilateral adduction, short lever, bilateral adduction, long lever, and then we'll go unilateral hip profile. So third from the left on the top row is hip extension in outer range, and then hip flexion in inner range. So you're looking at that inner range hip flexion to outer range hip extension profile, which is what we look for from a running mechanics point of view. And then we might do hip extension in inner range to hip flexion in outer range. And then we might measure the hip flexion in outer range to hip extension in outer range on the contralateral hip profile in terms of what we're looking for. So you can look at different torque positions at different ranges versus different functions in terms of where you are. So just understand that you're trying to test a different vector profile as opposed to a different muscle profile. So this is another case study just done to iterate this point on a Premier League footballer that's had a rec fem injury and then re-injured the rec fem, and then on part of the rehab had another little minor aspect, and it's a right rec fem. And you can see here clearly that on knee extension, so utilizing rec fem, they're more than 10% stronger, nearly 15% stronger than the non-affected limb, which is great. It means the rehab that is done has been brilliant within that club and really awesome. And at this point, they were like, okay, cool, we're good to go. But you then look at his hip profile, and obviously rep fem is a biarticular. You could almost argue it's a triarticular muscle, but certainly biarticular. And there's some imbalances there. The hip extension is really good, 66.5 kilograms or 660 newtons, really good. I mean, our top end guys in some sports are over 100 kilograms, but that's still really good force profile. But you then look at flexion, adduction, abduction, we're all at 65, 67%. So there's a significant imbalance within that hip. And the hip extension, knee extension is really good, which is obviously a combined movement for vertical force. But that torque production in open chain now is unlikely to be well balanced and unlikely to give the support. And certainly if you're looking at rep fem, hip flexion, which is down, versus knee extension, which is above where it needs to be, you now got an abnormal torque, what I'd call an intramuscular torque. So the force profile within the muscle is abnormal and it's not being distributed through the whole length of the muscle. The majority of the force profile is distal and not proximal, and that's an increased risk. So the other things we did with this guy was look at, well, is there a difference in muscle mass? And we did ratios, just circumferential ratios, so proximal quad, mid-third, distal quad, and it was all pretty symmetrical. So you're like, okay, cool, you know, maybe the muscle mass is there, but then we followed that up with a DEXA, and you can see that the right-hand side lacks muscle mass. So now I've got a right-hand side that lacks muscle mass, that has an increased force profile at the knee with a reduced force profile into hip flexion at the hip, with insufficient support potentially from the adductors, from adduction and abduction, and I've got an increased risk. And so therefore then we need to back off a little bit and say, okay, well, he may look like he's ready to go, but maybe he's not ready to go. We need to rethink about this a little bit. So if we move that on to pathology, and again, I'm going to flick over some of this, probably to put too much detail. So if I'm looking at testing, there's kind of 6 main buckets that I look at testing. So kinetic tests, right, which is what we talked about earlier with our kinematic pair, our kinematic chain, our kinematic system. So one joint, multiple joints, multiple systems in terms of what we look for. Kinematics, within the physio world, we'll talk about this in terms of arthro, myo, and neuro. So the individual movement qualities of those elements. The next 2 is more specialist physio, so neurological self-locking, motor control, special tests. Then the load transfer is where the KangaTech, the handheld dynamometry, the force plates come in. Right? Am I looking at global load transfer? Am I looking at uni-joint load transfer or multi-joint load transfer when I put the data together? So even though Kanga and handheld dynamometry might be looking at one vector profile, you put the vector profiles together, as we said, to give you an outcome in terms of that kinematic chain. And then you might want to look at a system-based profile of that dynamometry. And then we get symptom modification for how can we change things if we've got a problem from a pathology point of view. So the key things we're really looking at here are 1, 2, and 5. And we might be specific within tissues. So joints, compression and tension, capsules, laxity and restriction, muscles, force and length, tendons, compliance and efficiency, and nerve sensitivity and mobility. But what we're really asking is, can we stress test the structure in the region, and can it withstand stress? And that might be an individual tissue, or that might be a whole area. We're going to always try and cluster tests and multiple tests in one area to try and remove any bias. So I might have a bias in believing that X is going to happen. Well, if I now do 3 tests and they all prove to me that that's positive, then that's valid. So again, the best example I give you, a Lachman's for an ACL is not indicative of just an ACL. But if you've got a Lachman's with a mechanism of injury, with a pivot shift, with an anterior draw, odds on you've got an ACL in terms of what you're doing. So 4 tests is way better than 1. Like I said right at the beginning, look to rule out. So do tests to prove something is not involved. Don't just do tests to prove that it is involved. And then try and make up tests to prove your thought process wrong. And if you can prove your thought process wrong, then maybe you haven't got it right. But if you can't prove your thought process wrong, then maybe you have got it right. And I know that's a mouthful, but it's a mindset thing. And then we look at provocation versus dysfunction. So is this an area that is inefficient, or is it producing pain? So this is like what we would do if we were doing a quick hamstring screen on an athlete getting ready to go out there. And this is the girl you've seen running before. And always when you're filming, the coach is going to come in and give you a hard time but yeah, he changed his mind. So we're just doing a series of different sort of load transfer tests around the limbs at different lever arms, closed chain, open chain, different lengths, to then sort of just stress different tissues in different ways, whether that's muscle, whether that's tendon, whether there's a little bit of joint stress going through some of these areas as well. All right, and you can see her here, she's quite petite, but she, you know, I was probably the best part of 90 kilos at that point in time, and she could generate a lot of force, and I can't move her. And that's even with pushing up through my legs in that kind of instance. So petite, but relatively strong, albeit we said earlier she wasn't quite strong enough. And then you look at this energy transfer, and there's some really nice things that's going on there in terms of her efficiency of movement, and then her ability to resist the perturbation as an elastic, decentralized system. So looking at a kind of a modified version of like a Franz Bosch decentralized reflex of the tendon, Golgi tendon organ to the muscle spindle. Now, you know, those things may be dysfunctional, and if you've got a strength deficit as well, then you're looking at other issues. You can do your endurance testing, which has to sit alongside some of your strength testing. Lots of people we see do endurance testing. They say, oh, well, your endurance is down, and then you measure their strength, and their strength's down as well. And so the endurance might be down because they just can't produce enough force repeatedly, and so they fatigue faster. And it's not really an endurance issue, it's a strength issue. So you need to be sure where you're testing and what you're testing for. And so quite often, if we're doing endurance testing, we'll use a NIRS, which is a near infrared spectrometry, which measures the oxygenation in the muscle as you go. But don't forget about simple things like muscle mass. So this is an elite level 100-meter sprinter. That's his biceps femoris, which is pretty impressive. And you look at that short head biceps, and that's just phenomenal. It's like a mini me just popping out of his leg. And you think, oh, wow, that's an amazing hamstring. No wonder he can run 10 flat multiple times. But then you ask yourself the question, well, why does he keep getting biceps femoris injuries? Because that looks pretty damn strong. And then you look at his inside hamstring, and there's pretty much nothing there. And you're like, yeah, no wonder he's just overusing one of his hamstrings and not redistributing the force through the adductors and through the medial hamstring to absorb that energy. So don't miss the wood through the trees and do strength testing and miss the fact that this guy doesn't have a medial hamstring. And that's important if we're going to rebalance his force output. All right, and not try and take all the load in one. Now, obviously, there's some great work done by Nicole in terms of reducing risk on force profiles, whether you're using some kind of Nordic hamstring, which obviously you can do on the Kanga profile, which is incredibly useful, or whether you then go on and do some kind of dynamometry around the hamstring itself to measure its force output. And we look at the forces that are occurring at 500 newtons versus those that are occurring in terms of the symmetry and or the maximum force production. Now, I think this is good, but the problem is that when you really start to understand hamstrings, much like we talked about with the calf, with that sprinter, the energy that's being produced at 9 meters a second max speed is somewhere around 2000 watts or 2000 newtons of energy. Now, some of that's coming from the tendon. So is the muscle really capable of producing all the force that you need it to do? And certainly if we're then looking at repeated sprint efforts, we can talk up to like 10,000 newtons or worth of energy that's being utilized within a sprint aspect of like, say, 30 meters or so from some of the analysis we've done. So we're not even close when we're measuring some of this, but it still means it's valuable. So maybe that's one question. The other element is these are slow speed tests and the limb is moving at a high velocity movement. So the limb will be moving at 750 degrees a second, which is 2 to 3 times faster than what you're testing at 360 or 180 degrees of a hamstring isokinetic dynamometry. So looking at your cybexes, etc. So they're good tests to do, I would say, but they're not going to be end stage tests to do. So you might want to go more functional. Now, this is an elite level Olympic gold medalist rower who's had multiple medial hamstring issues and ended up having more than one surgery on his medial hamstring. This is him in a rehab phase, and he's doing a single leg eccentric hamstring on with 180 kilos there, and at his best, he was doing it on 200 kilos on one leg. All right, so you're now talking 2000 newtons worth of energy being produced. And when we do the dynamics and we measure the biomechanical lever arms, etc., it works out to be about 1,200 newtons or 120 kilograms in one hamstring. Now, that's a lot stronger than what we're testing for. So we need to use the test to give us that green light to move on, to then say, well, how do we understand function for return to sport? And that might be with a profile like this, or it might be utilizing some kind of force plate here. Whoops, went one too fast. And we use the force plate where we then pin them down and we measure, not only do we measure their force, which we can do this using the KangaTech, and you'll see that in a second, but we can measure their rate of force development. So the KangaTech will be much quicker because it's a straightforward dynamometer to do this. But if we want to look at some of the RF, the rate of force development, then we might want to look at it and or look at it bilaterally. We might want to look at it using this data. And so it's then understanding where does all of these different sort of systems fit and how do I utilize them? Because they all give us slightly different answers. And this is, again, another footballer that was getting ready for the World Cup that we reviewed, who'd had this 3C injury. And when you speak to his team, they said, look, he's got no symptoms. So can we get him back to training? Because there's nothing there to tell us no. And I'm like, well, sometimes there's some subtle things here. So we did a screening. There was a few things that made us think there's some subtle stuff going on. So then we did his force trace here. And we can see that when we do his force trace, that even though left equals right in the green line, and you can see the force numbers up in the top left element of the Excel sheet there, what you can see from the left equals right in terms of the force production down the bottom in the blue and the orange, it's taking a lot longer for the orange to come up to meet the same force. So it's lagging behind. And that's okay if we're doing slow speed strength work in the gym, or it's a slow sport in terms of a force generating sport. But if this is a high speed sport where you need to react and move quickly and decelerate quickly, then you're going to miss something in that element. All right. And so that becomes a huge risk for re-injury. So I wanted to point out here that we also got to adapt it depending on the individual. Now, this may not work very well because it's 4 videos running at the same time, but I'm not going to go into massive detail. But this is Alison Felix, obviously one of the greatest Olympians of all time, if not the greatest, with 13 medals, her running down the back straight in 400 meters. You can see here, good stride length, rear side dominant mechanics, not really a high frequency, but she's moving at about 9 meters a second there. All right. So that's pretty rapid when you think about it. You compare her to Shelly Ann Fraser-Price on the 100 meters, which should come up there. Now, this is front side mechanics, big stride length, big frequency. She's moving at, again, she'll start at 9 meters a second, but she'll get well over 10 meters a second, if not close to, if not slightly above 11 meters a second. I think she's been clocked at around about 36, 37 kilometers an hour, which is just rapid, right? So different, similar-ish speed, but different mechanics, completely different mechanics, let alone technique. Now, this one might take a while just to run. So this is Gareth Bale down the bottom. I'll just wait for it to run. There we go. Now, what Bale's doing here, hitting, I think it's hitting about 35 kilometers an hour, which is, again, over 9 meters a second. He's sacrificing stride length for stride frequency. So in order to control the ball and to be evasive, which football is an evasive, technical, tactical sport, yeah, so 34.7 kilometers an hour. He's sacrificing stride length for frequency. So his demand on his hips is much higher. So I wouldn't necessarily worry so much about his quad and his calf, his ankle and his knee. Obviously, I want it good, but I'm not going to worry about it so much to hit to that level. And then you compare that to, say, someone like Tyreek Hill here, and this is Tyreek doing acceleration versus top end. And it says he hits about 22 miles an hour, but he can hit much higher than that at top end speed. But this is acceleration mechanics. So he's all out the back because he's accelerating. There's not much front side mechanics going on there. But it's all quad and calf dominant with some hip drive going on, but dominant quad and calf sort of acceleration mechanics. So my point here is that all 4 of them are hitting the same speed. They're all doing it in an incredibly different way. And therefore, their muscle demand is all really different at different moments in time, whether it's acceleration out the blocks from a standing start or upright acceleration with someone like Bale. So we shouldn't really be debating which exercises we should be using or which muscles we should be working. We should be looking at how do we augment the athlete as the N of 1, as the individual, to maximize their performance. And the only way we're going to know that is through effective testing. And we see that again with the same girl running, where her hamstring, if you watch it, is working isometrically, concentrically, eccentrically. So all these arguments over eccentric versus isometric, again, I don't think are particularly valid. You'd watch her, she hip extends before the shank reaches terminal swing phase. So she's offloading her hamstring by not getting to that terminal eccentric component by hip extending early, and good runners will do that. The people that are overloading their hamstrings have got poor running technique in kinematics, and again, they're not the same thing. And they're overloading the hamstring because the shank is getting almost to terminal swing phase before they hip extend. And that's a big component. Now that then becomes an adductor-based issue to initiate that hip extension in that terminal swing phase, all right? And as we said already, we've got to understand the role of tendons here, not just the muscle. And we saw that earlier with the calf raise test, but this just highlights the energy utilization from Roberts, where they showed that if the muscle at the empty junction is producing 11 kilograms there, 11.24, sorry, 11 joules per kilogram, the tendon is producing 54 at the MTU as a transfer of energy, so 5 times the amount that the muscle fascicle is producing. And if we go down from an energy storage point of view, from an elastic capability, well, the non-contractile tissue at the MTU is probably producing around 2,000 watts per kilogram, but the muscle fascicle is only producing 500 watts per kilogram. So that's how we get to those kind of, you know, let's call it maybe a little bit suspect mass, but the mass when we're looking at the calf where it's producing 2,700 watts and the muscle force is at 500 kilograms, which is therefore 7 times body weight. All right. And we need to understand that, again, I'm going to go over this relatively quickly, but it's more just to stimulate your thinking about muscle gearing and the way the pennation angle of the muscle, the architecture, then influences the aponeurosis as you move, and as the muscle also rotates to create more movement as this muscle unit to the series elastic component as you're moving. So when you're looking at a muscle as a biarticular, you've got the elastic component proximally, you've got the muscle centrally with an intramuscular tendon centrally, which is a more elastic, and then an elastic component distally, which if that's biceps, then you may have a short head and long head going on there as well. So highly complex systems. You then throw in the fact that at top end sprinting, a lot of this is negative energy that's increasing exponentially from Brian Heidesek's work, which means that that energy is going to the tendon, and then the muscle has to react off the tendon, which is why I argue the isometric to eccentric is not relevant. It's a tendon reflex and the muscle is reacting off the tendon. And therefore, depending on the stride length and the speed, at some points that's going to be isometric, at some points that's going to be eccentric, because the limb movement is too fast for this to be a centrally controlled mechanism. We then also see from internal work done by Hergertz here that the muscle contour changes, whether that's at proximal and it's concaved, whether it's middle and it's complex curvature, or whether it's distal and it's convexed, all right? So that's why we wouldn't just do a Nordic hamstring on a Nord board, because it's just not going to give you the information you need it to give you. You need to do multiple hamstring testing in multiple ranges of movement. It's a biarticular muscle with a highly complex tendon system, with a highly complex muscle architecture system, from semimembranosis to biceps femoris to tendinosis, with different changes in different contour of that intra-articular muscle component at different ranges. So what Amy's doing here, and Amy's an ex-international long jumper and now pro bodybuilder, and hopefully she's not going to break the machines, but we've got her testing inner range hamstring at prone 0-90, so 0 hip, 90 degrees flexion. We've got to change to mid-range hamstring at prone 0, 30 degrees flexion. So similar towards what Aspetar might do with the supine test, but slightly different mechanics, because we want to look at hamstring function, whereas the supine test, you're looking at total extension function, because the glutes, the adductors, the lumbar spine is all creating force. Even the abdominals are creating force to generate that extension torque. And it's less about the vector profile within the hamstring complex, albeit not isolated hamstring muscle function, but a vector profile is more about total extension force as opposed to just hamstring force. And then we'll go to the 90-90 and then the 90-45. that you can see here. So the ability to move through these 4 tests really quickly and seamlessly is super important. All right, when you're assessing a muscle, and you might use different tests at different times in the rehab. So the inner range stuff early in the rehab, the 90-90 in the intermediate, and then the 90-45 at the end stage of the rehab. So change your test depending on where you are in what you're doing. All right, final straight people. So performance-wise, for us, rehab and performance is a continuum. So I've used that interchangeably throughout this talk. But the key is the question you're asking in rehab is slightly different than the question you're asking at performance. But what you need the athlete to do might be very similar at different moments in time within both a rehab and a performance basis. So I worked on this with David, and David helped me produce this SAGKIN, that is. But we have different systems. So this is a basic system where you've got stage 1 to stage 2, 3, 4, 5, and 6, and 1 being dealing with pain, stage 2 dealing with restoring symmetrical limb strength, and that's really about the vertical force. Stage 3 doing the unilateral strength, which is more about the hip torque, where the hip profile comes in. Stage 4 is about return to running. Stage 5 about return to sport. Stage 6 about return to performance. Now, if that's a muscle injury, this shifts to a 7-stage profile. If that's a tendon injury, this is an 11-stage profile. All right. So you've got to understand what you're trying to achieve, and then you modulate your profiles and your rehab depending on what you're trying to do. And then the trick for me here is you now do this, and you put your dynamometry, whether that's Kanga or, as it says here, handheld, but I've got the Kanga data here, and that Kanga data aligns with your rehab phases. So for the pain and restoration of movement, we want a prone 0-30 Kanga profile of at least 10 kilograms, and it might be prone 0-90 depending on what we're trying to do. When we move to the symmetrical limb strength, we're now looking for this intermediate stage at the supine 90-90 Kanga profile at between 20 to 30 kilograms. And I'll say this, it's on an average male, 75-80 kilogram male in football, in terms of what we're looking for here. And then when we look to that unilateral limb hip torque profile, we're now moving to the Kanga at 90-45 at greater than 35 kilograms. Now, when we move to running, return to sport performance, we're not so interested in the Kanga, because while you can get stronger, it doesn't necessarily mean that the running and sport and performance side of things gets better. It might be that you need to get stronger still, but then I would shift that stage 3 up to 45, or if that's an elite level male sprinter, that supine Kanga 90-45 needs to be way over 50 kilograms, right? So the profile shifts depending on the sport. But now we're moving into running profiles, and the Kanga profile fits into the running profile nicely to make sure that we're getting appropriate adaptation before we get there. Now, then here comes the even bigger trick for us. So we've got this first 2 phases, which is well aligned. Now what we're going to do is we're going to align a 3rd phase, which is now exercise prescription and criteria-based exercise outcomes associated with the Kanga and with the stages of healing. So just to go through the simple bit, stage 1, Kanga 0-30 at 10 kilograms. We expect you to be able to do hamstring bridges, 5 sets of 15 reps, all right, on feet elevated on a bench, and off you go. And that equates to that profile of an average person. Now, obviously, there'll be variations within individuals, but that's kind of some criteria we're looking for. And that hamstring exercise could change. You might use something different. You might just use a glute bridge because you're more worried about the hip control and the proximal tendinopathy than you are about a distal hamstring muscle injury where you might use the hamstring bridge more. So again, it's going to shift. Stage 2, supine 90-90 Kanga. Now we're looking at Nordics, razor curls, prone curls, standing curls as being a key criteria in 4 sets of 8 or something like that. And it might be an isometric, it might be a concentric eccentric, it might be a dominant eccentric, depending on what we're trying to change. So if we're trying to hypertrophy, then we're going to go more concentric. If we're trying to get more empty junction, tissue resilience, then we're going to go more eccentric, right? And then stage 3, again, we're now looking at this. We're looking at some kind of eccentric flywheel or prone heavy eccentric curl or rapid stretch eccentric curl and drop catches and stuff like that. Then we might move into tension drills for the running, high speed drills, for limb velocity of movement, and then PB on all exercises for that return to performance. And all of that's also got to be balanced with the inflammatory phases and the healing phases. So don't push these things like stage 1 to stage 6 beyond that modeling phase. All right. So that becomes our performance criteria. So just to finish off, I'm going to go back to this case study, and I've seen on the call, Alejandro's on the call, and this is an athlete that we worked closely with Alejandro, and they did some amazing work to try and help this guy out. And this is just some of our data analysis where we're trying to analyze where he's moving. So I showed you this from before as he comes out the blocks. Side on, so you just reiterate, and you can see the knees are way too bent. He's not extending it high enough. The drive, the vertical force isn't there. It's all pull phase. He's pulling too far, too hard backwards. The calf isn't really getting enough propulsion. The feet are collapsing as he lands. So he's not getting the ankle foot stiffness, and he's almost overusing his hip extension knee flexion to generate that force. And then you watch it from behind. Right, and there's a lot of movement. But then if we add the data onto this to then say, well, what do we see versus what does the data tell us here? And we can see here, look, that quad strength, that's phenomenal. 4.3 and 4.7 times body weight, awesome. Like ideal in an elite sprint is 5, but he's just off that. And the right side's a little bit weaker. So we understand that, and this is a right hamstring, distal hamstring related issue. We look at that calf and it's a long way off. Right, so that 3 and 2.9, long way off from where we want him to be, right? So therefore, his quad to calf ratio is at 65 or 67%. And so the ankle, we can see that when he's running, he's not generating enough ankle foot stiffness. We can see he's not extending the knees well enough to generate enough vertical force, probably because the feet are collapsing, so he's trying to overuse the knees to generate that force. And then the right side's the weaker side, which then placing more load on the hamstring. And we're going to confirm that all a bit more in a minute. And then we go on to the jump data, and 56 is pretty decent. As a jump profile, it's just above average from an elite track and field point of view, with 70 being, truly world class. And the RSI is at 3.8, but the RSI is truly world class, right? So 3 is a really good score. 3.8 is a phenomenal RSI. So his elastic coefficient is really good. His tendons are really powerful. So when his muscle starts to fatigue and it isn't generating the force, he's going to overuse the tendons to do what he needs to do. Now, this is our report a little bit here, and just in terms of the analysis, so greater than 4 times body weight, 8% in asymmetry, but not quite strong enough. Calf really poor. Plant flexion to squat ratio at 65, 67%. And then a little bit of a narrative why that's going to be increasing the relative stiffness here. And then a little bit in terms of the force output and the explosivity coming out of the blocks, and why he's probably going to be overusing the strain on the non-contractile tissue and keep overloading those hamstring tendons in terms of what he's trying to do. And then we move into like our hip profiling with Kanga here, where we've done the bilateral abduction to adduction. And then the unilateral abduction to adduction here, we didn't do it bilaterally. And then the extension to flexion profiles, the seated soleus, and then looking at some of those profiles below, extension to flexion, abduction, flexion to extension at the knee and at the hip. And you can analyze each of these based on your normative data. So adduction, we're looking at roughly, ideally around 35 kilograms and upwards, abduction around about 30, but a minimum of 25. And then sort of like, what's our minimum criteria, what's our max, and where do we go for it from there? And so there's some things here that's really good, and then there's some things here that we can work on, but none of that was really a concern. And a lot of the asymmetry were not really bad, but the adduction asymmetry is a problem. And again, he's overusing those adduction on the right-hand side, probably to augment for that lack of knee extension force. And so the adduction as part of the medial hamstring load and as part of the adductor and hamstring hip extension load is probably getting overloaded because it's dominant versus an under-dominant knee in terms of the extension force, albeit the strength score is very good, but the symmetry is off, which then gives us more reason for concern around the vertical force production. And this again just highlights the balance when we look at some of the graphs and where we're looking for. And again, we can see that knee flexion to extension ratio being a long way off from where we want it to be, particularly on that right-hand side, which again gives us more margin for concern in terms of that symmetry index, whereas the left is more symmetrical, which gives us more reason for why the left is not being overloaded from that symmetry index around the knee. So when we break down his running here, now I did this on my phone, so the lines aren't particularly straight, but we analyze the lines anyway, separate to that, so we can get that. Now what we see is on picture 1 to picture 2 is he drops into a varus, flicks into it on real time when you do it in slow motion, and then he drops into adduction. So he's got this coronal plane movement about the knee, which means that he's probably doing that to create more hip extension force. And you can see on that right-hand picture, his right shoulder is over his right hip, which is then he's changing his axis of load, which is an abnormal hip force generation profile when you do that, which means you're trying to maximize that hip extension force and minimize the hip abduction force to maximize the extension. And therefore he's then using that to lock the hip in to generate a force, but the knee's now in a valgus, which is placing a lot more load on that medial knee. You look at his left foot on his second step and it's pretty good. The alignment's pretty good, foot to knee to hip to shoulder is pretty good. We look at that second step on the right, or third step in total, and now what we've got, sorry, first step on the left, second step on the right, yeah, third step in, second step on the right, not third step, that's my bad. And you can see he's already abducted because he was already in a varus. So the force means he has to pull out into abduction. The foot's turned out. And as he lands on that third picture in that second step, now the foot's turned out, the knee's being torsioned, the hip's being torsioned, the whole body's rotating. And so we see a rotation problem. But I would argue the deficit when you look at the strength data is in extension and adduction in terms of abduction, so vertical and horizontal, and not in rotation, but the movement we see is a rotation compensation for the horizontal, sagittal, vertical dysfunctions. And then we move that on to just augment this, and we see that the third step on the left, so the second step on the left, is still well aligned, but we get to the fourth step or the second step on the right, and now it's still malaligned. So we're getting good symmetry on the left, poor symmetry on the right. There's a justification for this within the strength data that we've utilized and tested. But only by doing all of this do you get a really true indication of the individual. Right, I've massively overrun, mainly because we had a bit of a problem with the video and I had to backtrack through it, but also I put way too many slides in there, but hopefully you've got a huge amount of knowledge and or exposure within a very short period of time. Here's some of my handles. Please go through KangaTech if you've got some interest in there. Like I said, it's something that we use all the time because it just makes us so much more efficient in our analysis and what we do. But also it's about understanding where that fits in the wider picture, which hopefully I've been able to do for all of you guys today. I'm happy to hang around to take any questions. Those of you in England who need to go and get drunk and drink beer at 9 o'clock at night, that's perfect. If you're in the States with me, it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon. It might still be a bit early, but it's Friday, so why not? I think a beer always makes you smarter. So definitely you need a beer after you've listened to me speak for 2 hours for more than one reason. All right, I'll shut up now and I'll let any questions come and Chris and James take over.
Thanks, James. Appreciate your time. Apologies for the small technical issue there, but yeah, we got through it all, and I'm sure everyone who's joined tonight has taken massive value from that. I will check for questions in a minute. I'm not sure we have any at the moment. I think that was pretty substantial, and I'd imagine, as usual, once we get offline, we'll get a number of questions come through to us directly, which we can always send your way. Although I imagine James will potentially have a couple of questions or things that he might need to ask, so I will hand it over to him and see what he's got in store for you.
Yeah, cheers, Chris, and cheers, James. That was fantastic, really comprehensive view into the way that you not only test the guys throughout rehabilitation and in performance, but interpret the data, which I think is the significant thing you got across tonight. Obviously, it was a comprehensive view on many data points that you look at and utilize throughout rehabilitation and performance. But if we put James Moore in a team sport right now, as you're in, and we were looking to mitigate injury risk at the start of the season and really identify some factors that we wanted to work on with some of the athletes, but we only have a couple of hours to go through as many tests as we possibly can with a squad of 20, 30 guys at the start of the season. What are you picking apart? What are you utilizing? What's your bang for buck? Where do you start? Is it a hip profile like you mentioned, or do you add on little bits and bobs from there?
Yeah, good question, mate. And I think exceptionally relevant. And as you indicated, it morphs depending on where you are and what environment you're in. And also, to a certain extent, albeit it shouldn't, it morphs depending on what facilities you have, what equipment you have, and how do you come up with looking at some of this stuff. Like I just did a consult this morning with a guy off a hamstring rupture from Doncaster. And I mean, you know, it's a Division 2 club. It doesn't have all the resources under the sun. So we've got to find ways of assessing, which is why I showed you some clinical tests versus other tests to give you an idea. And then you might want to come see us, see you guys at Kanga or somewhere else to get that one-off data set. And then you interpret that against your other data. But to backtrack and answer the question in more detail, I'd say the first thing I do is all in preparation. So understand my sport, understand where the injury profile sits within the sport. And have we got a dominant profile? So I remember when I went in at Saracens in 2012, and if you looked at the provisional data there, you would think shoulders and knees were our number one problem. But when you analysed shank to ankle foot related injuries, so calf, ankle foot related injuries, and you put them all together, as opposed to saying a calf muscle is different than, you know, an ankle sprain or something like that, because the demands are relatively similar in terms of function as opposed to tissue that's being damaged. Actually, our biggest injury profile was ankle foot, and it was the most frequent, but we didn't have as many time lost days. So we might have had 27 injuries at 10 days a pop versus 5 injuries at 50 days a pop in the knee, as we had 270 days lost in ankle foot versus 250 days lost in knees. And so you immediately think the knee's the problem because you split the data. So my comment would be is you've got to analyze the data in relevance to your sport. And what we then did was we built what we called a baby cow club, which is where a lot of this calf strength came from. And we strength trained a lot of their ankle foot, and our injury profile dropped. And then we took that on to the sevens guys in terms of where we're going. So I think you've got to make it specific to your sport. I think you've then got to look at your individuals. And so if you go to rugby, we know that the props have a much higher risk of ankle foot calf related injuries, and the outside backs, so the full backs and wingers and outside centres, have a much higher risk of hamstring injuries. So I think you've then got to ask yourself the question of, well, are we testing everybody the same and we're doing hamstring tests on everybody, or are we picking the people who are most at risk and we're doing the hamstring tests on the most at risk people, and we're not doing the hamstring tests on, you know, a 6'10", 30-something-year-old second row player who's never had a hamstring injury? And it's just not a lot of point in doing that, in my humble opinion. People might disagree with me where you want to go, I think. And then the final comment would be, it really comes down to, is this an injury risk, as you indicate, or is this a performance? And I think the two things are synonymous. And so I would try and weigh that up and say, well, what tests can we look at that might mitigate risk, but could also give us a performance benefit if we can maximize that injury profile? And so if that's hamstrings, then, okay, we're going to run faster. Well, if we run faster, the risk actually ironically goes up, even if you get stronger. So, you know, it's weighing those sort of things up in terms of where your risk analysis is going to be. Does that help?
Yeah, that's spot on. That makes sense. Just had a question come in from yet another James.
There's a
based
few
around
of us,
based around the knee extension protocol. Yep. Are you using the KangaTech to test isolated knee extension, and what angle of knee flexion extension are you measuring in? Is it mid-range 90-60 or what?
Yep. So yeah, exactly that. I think you can, so James, I think great question. I think really pertinent. I think you can go and look at protocols, and yes, the protocol we would use would be around 90-60 as a starter for 10. It's a mid-range. We want our first question is the muscle strong enough? Can it produce force at that joint, at that torque, at that vector profile? And that's kind of your first question you're asking. You then might have a question that you want to ask around inner range capability in the quad. So if you've got a recurrent patellofemoral joint issue, you might want to do something that's more at 0, 30 degrees knee flexion, so 0 at hip, 30 degrees knee flexion, and you're getting more of an inner range knee torque because you're worried about the patellofemoral joint, or you want to try and bias to more the distal quad rather than the total quad within its lever arm mechanism and what's happening. But as we know, vastus medialis is probably more of a deceleration muscle than it is a force producing muscle. So it will then be influenced by its movement speed than anything else, which then can influence the patellofemoral joint. Or we might be saying, well, we've had a recurrent rec fem injury, and we know that from the EMG data and some of the fine wire data that rec fem has a preferential activation at 90 degrees hip flexion, 90 degrees knee flexion. So we might do that in a supine knee extension test 90-90, as opposed to a seated knee extension test where they can just push back into it a little bit more and use, because they can push the hip into it a bit more and cheat that test if it's done in sitting. So it depends on whether we're looking at gross force or whether we're trying to, in inverted commas, isolate that vector profile in terms of what we're doing. And as I said, you know, are we testing through range? Are we testing one? What's the question we're really asking? And if you go back to sort of rec fem, well, rec fem has this really complex intramuscular tendon, and therefore what it's doing in hip extension knee flexion, so outer range, is going to be really different. And so we might do like a prone knee bend, but a knee extension test in the prone knee bend position to look at that tendon utilization within rec fem and argue that the tendon influence, because we know that rec fem's resting length is going to be influenced beyond 120 degrees knee flexion. So if I now take you to 140 degrees knee flexion, I've taken out the muscle fiber length in rec fem, and now I'm going to be looking at the augmentation onto the tendon. And so I can use that test to do that. So I think the beautiful thing with Kanga for me, as opposed to handheld dynamometry, you've got to either get on the floor, you've got to be on a bed, you've got to adjust the height, you've got to adjust your position, you've got to do it. Whereas Kanga, you basically set it up and you move the athlete or the subject around the Kanga, and then you do the test once you set the Kanga up to get the answer you want to get out of it, depending on the question you want to get out of it. So in short, you're correct. In a longer answer, it depends on what the hell you want to know. All right.
Cheers, James. Rob's come in with our final question of tonight, and he's actually put in the chat the question I was going to ask you, which is unbelievable. So you spoke about isometric plantar flexion, strength testing through standing or seated. How do you test through plantar flexion strength? A different test or isometric strength in various range?
Yeah, good question, bud. So again, I think it still comes back to what are you trying to know? So if we look at, again, I didn't put this in here, but if you look at force profiles, right? And if you look at some of the data, now some of the data is actually old, but the data would suggest that an isometric profile through range gives you a better strength curve than a concentric eccentric profile. And so the isometric is aligned as long as the contraction is not too long, so maximum of 5 to 6 seconds, it's lined to producing maximal force. Now then the question is, well, what's that maximum force relative to the lever arm, relative to the joint angle, relative to the muscle architecture? And so again, that's where I think you might want to do through range. So for example, if I'm doing peak plantar flexion force in plantar grade or slightly plantar flexion, I've got a mechanical disadvantage against soleus to be utilized, but I've got a mechanical advantage against gastroc. And so therefore, if I'm going to do it in those positions, I probably want an extended knee, right, in that position. So I don't want a flex knee, because if I've got a flex knee, I've got a mechanical disadvantage against gastroc. And now I'm in plantar grade, which is a mechanical disadvantage against soleus, and I'm in slight plantar flexion, which is a mechanical disadvantage. So now you're testing plantar flexion in a mechanical disadvantage for the two strongest muscles, which means you're just going to get a weak score, right? So, but if I want to test seated calf, I need soleus in a lengthened position because of its aponeurosis. Mid-range, so plantar grade is not mid-range for soleus. Soleus is mid-range because of its fiber angle, is actually end of range Dorsiflexion is its mid-range position. So you've got to put it on stretch. Now, then the big point here, which is why I think Mike Lancaster's work hasn't produced the forces they want to produce. I think the thinking is correct, but I don't think the execution is because when you do plantar flexion, your real fulcrum of movement is the metatarsals, and the second fulcrum is the ankle, but the triceps surae is moving about the ankle joint, not about the metatarsals, right? And so if the knee, even with the force being over the knee, which is what's happening in Mike Lancaster's study there, you're still asking the subject to hit flex into the band, and the ankle's all cranked up, whereas actually where you need the force, it needs to be over the metatarsal heads. And even though you're putting them in dorsiflexion and trying to shift them forward, which is what Mike was doing there to try and get the force over the metatarsal head, you haven't quite got the mechanical advantage at Soleus to do that, to really get the maximum force output. So you're just getting a low score because of the way the methodology is set up on the test biomechanically. So complex answer is, I think you can do anything you want to do. I think you just got to be clear as to what's the question you're really asking with it, rather than say, well, I'm going to do this test and the test is going to tell me what I want it to tell me. What you've got to do is you've got to ask yourself the question, what do I want to know? How do I set the test up to best inform me what I want to know? Which is a different mindset shift in terms of the question you're trying to ask. So hopefully that gives you some insight. And it basically tells you can do lots of different things, but you just need to be clear as to what does it really mean when you get the answer you're getting. And what I see in the data that's out there is everybody thinks they're measuring strength, and in fact, they're not measuring strength, they're measuring X, which might be different than strength, all right? So if you want to measure strength, you need to measure strength in the right position with the right lever arm and the right testing protocol, all right?
Yeah, makes sense. Great answer. Thank you very much. And I think we'll call it there for this evening. Thank you very much, James, for jumping on halfway through there and saving a stock presentation. Much appreciated. Hope you enjoy your evening in New York this evening. And Chris, over to you for just some final words.
Yeah, thanks very much, James. Appreciate that. Super stuff. And yeah, for those of you that are still with us, still logged on, as we said earlier, there will be a copy of the presentation been sent out to you in the coming days. So if there's anything you missed or you want to go back over, don't fret. You will have the resource and you will be able to look back over it. So yeah, we hope that you all enjoyed that. Got some great insight. And we look forward to seeing you on the next of our KangaTech webinars. So yeah, thanks very much, James. And thanks everyone for joining, and we'll see you soon. Cheers now.
Cheers, guys. Thank you.
Cheers.